Jake woke up to the sound of clanging metal and loud voices outside his window. His first thought was that the garbage truck had arrived way too early, but as he rubbed the sleep from his eyes and peeked through the blinds, his heart nearly stopped. His backyard, his carefully maintained, beautifully green private property, had been invaded. White folding chairs were neatly arranged in rows, an arch decorated with flowers stood proudly at the far end, and a team of decorators bustled around, setting up what looked like an elaborate wedding ceremony. He blinked, half convinced he was still dreaming. But no, this was real. This was happening. And then he saw her, the self-proclaimed queen of the neighborhood, Karen, standing in the middle of his yard, barking orders like she owned the place. Jake threw on a hoodie, stormed out the back door, and marched up to her. "Karen, what the hell is going on?" His voice was sharp, cutting through the chatter of workers. Karen turned to him with that infuriating, smug smile of hers. "Oh, Jake, you're finally up. We were beginning to worry you'd sleep through the whole thing." "The whole what? This is my yard. Why is there a wedding set up here?" Karen laughed, waving a dismissive hand. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. It's just for the day. My daughter's wedding, remember?" Jake's eye twitched. "No, I don't remember because no one asked me." Karen sighed, as if he were a child throwing a tantrum. "Jake, we sent out notices weeks ago. This is a community event. You should feel honored to be chosen for such an important day." He scanned the yard again, his blood pressure spiking. A DJ was setting up speakers near his fence. A catering van had pulled into his driveway. And was that a portable bathroom being wheeled into his front yard? "I don't care what notices you sent. I never agreed to this. Get this stuff out of my yard. Now." Karen's expression hardened. The fake smile melted into something more menacing. "Oh, Jake, you're making this difficult. Do you really want to be the only person in the neighborhood who ruins my daughter's special day?" Jake clenched his fists. "I don't give a damn about your daughter's special day. This is trespassing. You have no right." Karen raised a hand, cutting him off. "Oh, but I do. According to HOA regulations, community events can be hosted in any available space deemed suitable by the board. And guess what? We deemed your yard suitable." Jake's stomach twisted. He knew Karen and her band of HOA loyalists had been making up ridiculous rules for years. But this was a whole new level of insanity. "You can't just—" "Oh, but we can," Karen interrupted sweetly. "And unless you'd like to rack up some rather hefty fines for, let's see, an unsightly lawn, unauthorized external modifications, and parking violations." Jake's jaw tightened. She was threatening him. She had already decided this was happening, and the so-called fines were just her way of twisting his arm. A deep breath. He needed to think. He needed a plan. The wedding was happening in less than 6 hours. The yard was already halfway transformed into a venue. The caterers were unloading trays of food. The florist was draping flowers over everything in sight, and a group of giddy bridesmaids were taking selfies by his koi pond. Jake stormed back into his house and slammed the door shut. His brain was on fire. There had to be a way to turn this around. If Karen wanted a war, she was going to get one. He picked up his phone, considering his options. The police? No, Karen had made sure to wrap this whole thing in enough bogus HOA red tape to make it look official. He needed something faster, something that would ruin this wedding before it even began. Then, as he stared out the window at the pristine white tablecloths and delicate floral arrangements, an idea hit him. A wicked, brilliant idea. His property had an old underground sprinkler system, one he never used because the water that came out was disgusting. Rusty, murky, reeking of iron and dirt. It was a remnant of the old plumbing system that had been replaced years ago, but the pipes were still there, waiting. A slow grin spread across his face. Karen wanted a wedding in his yard? Fine. She would get exactly what she asked for. Jake wasted no time. He headed to the garage, pulled out his toolbox, and got to work. If everything went according to plan, this wedding was about to become the biggest disaster this neighborhood had ever seen. Jake paced in his kitchen, gripping his coffee mug like it was the only thing keeping him from throwing something. He had spent years dealing with the nonsense from Karen and her HOA minions, but this was on a whole new level of insanity. She had turned his backyard into a full-blown wedding venue without his permission, and the worst part was, she knew exactly how to manipulate the system to make sure she got away with it. He had to be smart about this. He had to hit back in a way that would make sure she never pulled something like this again. The sound of laughter outside made his blood boil. He peeked through the blinds, watching as a group of bridesmaids posed in front of the arch that had been set up near his fence. A few of them even had the audacity to wave at him, completely oblivious to the fact that he had never agreed to any of this. The caterers were setting up tables, lining them with expensive-looking dinnerware, while a DJ was testing the sound system near the porch. His yard looked like something out of a bridal magazine, and yet he was the only person in this entire equation who hadn't been consulted. His phone buzzed. It was Tom, one of the few reasonable people in the neighborhood. "Jake," Tom sighed as soon as he picked up. "I heard about what's happening. Man, I don't even know what to say." "You could start by telling me how Karen thinks she can get away with this," Jake snapped. Tom hesitated. "Look, you know how she is. She twisted the HOA rules just enough to make it seem like she's within her rights. She bullied the board into approving this. And if you try to fight it, she'll probably hit you with so many fake violations you won't know which way is up." Jake rubbed his temples. He already knew that much. Then I need to do something she can't argue with. Something legal, but something that'll ruin this whole thing. There was silence on the other end for a moment before Tom spoke again, lowering his voice. "You didn't hear this from me, but I found out something interesting. Karen didn't just choose your yard because she thought it was pretty. She chose it because she spent the HOA's event fund on herself. There was supposed to be a real venue, but she blew the budget on personal expenses. So, she made up some HOA nonsense to force you into this." Jake felt his grip on the phone tighten. Of course she had. The level of entitlement was unbelievable. But now he had an angle. Karen wasn't just being a tyrant. She was covering up her own mistakes. "Thanks for telling me," Jake muttered. "Now I just need to make sure this wedding doesn't go as planned." He ended the call and turned back to the window. His eyes locked onto the sprinkler system controls in the garage. That nasty old water had been sitting in the underground pipes for years. One flick of a switch, and his entire yard would turn into a swamp of rusty, muddy chaos. But he needed to time it perfectly. If he did it too soon, Karen would find a way to recover. He had to wait until just the right moment. When everything was set up, when the guests were settled, when the bride was about to walk down the aisle. He had to make sure it was a disaster Karen would never forget. As he was planning, there was a knock at his door. He opened it to find a man in a tuxedo standing there, looking a little uneasy. "Hey, you must be Jake," the man said. "I'm David. I'm the groom." Jake narrowed his eyes. "You're the guy marrying Karen's daughter?" David scratched the back of his head. "Yeah. Look, I just wanted to say, I had no idea she was doing all this. I thought we had a real venue booked. I didn't even know this was someone's private property until this morning." Jake studied him for a moment. He seemed genuine. "So you're saying Karen lied to everyone?" David exhaled. "I'm saying I wouldn't put it past her. She's been controlling every detail of this wedding. Stephanie, my fiancée, wanted something small. But Karen turned it into this. And now I'm standing in a stranger's doorway apologizing for something I didn't even do." Jake crossed his arms. "You realize you're about to marry into this, right?" David gave a dry laugh. "Trust me, I've been having second thoughts." He ran a hand down his face. "I just wanted to say I get why you're mad. If I were you, I'd be losing my mind." Jake sighed. As much as he wanted to hate everyone involved in this, he couldn't help but feel a little sorry for the guy. "Well, you're not wrong." He glanced past David to see Karen on the other side of the yard, directing more vendors like a dictator overseeing a kingdom. His frustration flared up again. "Look, man, I appreciate you coming over here. But this wedding is a complete joke, and I'm not just going to sit back and let her walk all over me." David nodded. "Fair enough. Whatever you're about to do, maybe don't destroy the whole wedding. Stephanie doesn't deserve that." Jake considered that for a second. Then he shrugged. "No promises." David sighed but didn't argue. He just gave Jake a nod and walked back toward the chaos. Jake shut the door and checked the time. 2 hours until the ceremony started. That gave him just enough time to fine-tune his plan. He grabbed his toolbox and went out to the garage, making sure everything was ready. He wasn't going to flood the yard just yet. No, he was going to wait. He was going to let them think everything was going perfectly. Then, right when Karen thought she had won, he was going to make sure this wedding became the single worst event in HOA history. The sun was shining, the guests were arriving, and the wedding was coming together exactly as Karen had envisioned, except for one small detail. The man who actually owned the yard was watching from his window, waiting for the perfect moment to turn this dream event into an unforgettable nightmare. Jake sipped his coffee, his heart pounding with anticipation. He had checked everything twice. The rusted sprinkler system was ready, the water was primed in the underground pipes, and the moment Karen felt like she was on top of the world, he was going to flip the switch. Outside, laughter and chatter filled the air. The groom's side of the family was seated, making polite small talk, unaware of the disaster that was about to unfold. The bride's side was another story. They were loud, obnoxious, and almost as entitled as Karen herself. A group of middle-aged women in expensive dresses complained about the humidity, fanning themselves dramatically. A few children ran around, completely unchecked, stomping through Jake's flower beds as their parents ignored them. Jake's fists clenched when he spotted Karen at the front of the yard, greeting people as if she were the queen of a royal gala. She smiled, laughed, and acted as though she personally owned the entire neighborhood. She hadn't even glanced at Jake's house, confident that he had been defeated. It was almost funny how easily she believed she could get away with this. The music started. The DJ, set up near the fence, cranked up some soft, romantic tune as the procession began. The bridesmaids made their way down the makeshift aisle, each one stepping carefully to avoid the uneven patches in the yard. The audience watched, their expressions warm and sentimental. Everything was going perfectly. Jake's hand hovered over the switch. Not yet. He had to time this just right. Karen stood near the front, beaming with pride. Her daughter, Stephanie, was about to make her grand entrance. The guests stood up, turning their heads in anticipation. The music swelled. The moment had arrived. Jake flicked the switch. It started as a quiet gurgle. At first, no one even noticed. Then, with a sudden hiss, the underground pipes released years of trapped, stagnant water. The sprinklers burst to life, spewing dark, murky liquid in every direction. The first few rows of guests were hit instantly, shrieking as their expensive outfits were soaked in brown, foul-smelling sludge. The water gushed from the ground in erratic sprays, covering the perfectly decorated chairs, the pristine white tablecloths, and the towering wedding cake. Chaos erupted. The DJ's speakers sparked and died as water splashed over the electrical equipment. The bridesmaids screamed, clutching their dresses as they scrambled to escape the flood of filth. Elderly guests stumbled backward, slipping in the quickly forming mud. The pristine white aisle was now a swamp, and the carefully arranged flower petals turned into soggy clumps of disaster. And then came the bride. Stephanie stepped into the yard, ready for her big moment, only to be met with complete pandemonium. Her white dress, once pristine and glowing, was instantly ruined as she stepped directly into a puddle of sludge. She shrieked, lifting the fabric, but it was too late. The bottom half of her gown was stained beyond repair, the lace soaked in rust-colored water. Jake stood at his window, watching the scene unfold with pure satisfaction. But the real show was just beginning. Karen's face went from blissful joy to absolute horror. She stormed toward the sprinkler system, slipping on the wet grass, barely catching herself. She whipped around, her expression full of rage, scanning the yard until her eyes locked onto Jake's house. Jake stepped onto his back porch, crossing his arms as Karen stomped toward him, mud splattering her heels. "You did this," she shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at him. Jake shrugged. "Oh, I don't know what you mean. Seems like a plumbing issue. Maybe you should have picked a real venue instead of stealing someone's backyard." Karen's hands curled into fists. "You ruined my daughter's wedding." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Did I? Because last time I checked, you never had permission to use my yard in the first place." Stephanie, now on the verge of tears, turned to her mother. "Mom, what is he talking about?" Karen stammered, glancing at the guests who were now whispering amongst themselves. Some of them had pulled out their phones, recording the chaos, eager to capture the scandal unfolding before them. Jake smirked. "Oh, you didn't tell them? You didn't tell your daughter that this wasn't actually a venue? That you didn't even bother to book a real place because you spent the HOA money on yourself?" The crowd gasped. Karen's face drained of color. Stephanie's expression shifted from heartbreak to fury. "You told me everything was taken care of. You said we had a beautiful outdoor venue booked." Karen floundered. "Sweetie, you lied to me?" Stephanie's voice cracked. "You used someone's private property? You didn't even ask him." By now, the groom's family was edging away from the bride's side, their expressions full of disgust. David, the groom, stepped forward, shaking his head. "Wow, this just keeps getting worse." He turned to Stephanie. "You knew your mom was controlling, but this is insane." Stephanie's lip trembled. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." David exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. I need to think. I need a second. He turned and walked off, leaving Stephanie standing alone, her ruined dress clinging to her legs. Karen, seeing everything spiraling out of control, desperately tried to regain command of the situation. All right, everyone, calm down. We can fix this. We'll just move the wedding inside. Jake chuckled. Inside? You mean into my house? That's cute. Get off my property before I call the cops. Karen's eyes burned with rage, but she had no choice. She turned, trying to salvage what little was left of the event, but it was useless. The guests were already leaving, murmuring amongst themselves about what a disaster it was. Jake watched with satisfaction as the wedding fell apart before Karen's eyes. The expensive decor was ruined, the guests were furious, and worst of all, her secret about the HOA funds was now out in the open. As the last few guests trudged away, Karen shot Jake one final glare. You'll pay for this. Jake smiled. I think you already have. With that, he turned, stepping back into his house, leaving Karen standing in the muddy wreckage of what was supposed to be her perfect day. Karen stood in the middle of Jake's backyard, her once pristine dress splattered with mud, her hair frizzing from the moisture in the air. The wedding guests had mostly scattered, some helping each other to their cars, others too busy gossiping about what had just unfolded. The expensive decorations, the flowers, the white chairs, everything was soaked, stained, or sinking into the mess of water and mud that now covered the lawn. The cake had collapsed under the weight of the water, its once intricate design now resembling a melted pile of sugar and regret. Jake leaned against his back porch railing, watching with satisfaction as Karen frantically tried to salvage what was left. She barked orders at the few remaining vendors, but no one was listening. The florists were packing up what little they could. The DJ was shaking his head at his ruined equipment, and the caterers were arguing over who was responsible for the massive disaster. Stephanie, still standing in her destroyed wedding dress, was shaking with rage. Her mascara had smeared, her hair was frizzed from the sudden soaking, and her once beautiful dress was completely ruined. She glared at her mother, her voice cracking as she demanded answers. You lied to me. You told me everything was planned, that it was a proper venue. You said it was all taken care of. Karen turned to her, forcing a smile as if she could somehow fix this with sheer willpower. Sweetie, we can still. No, Mom, we can't. Stephanie snapped. The wedding is over. It's ruined. And it's all because you couldn't just do things the right way. David, the groom, had been silent through most of the chaos, but now he took a deep breath and stepped forward, shaking his head. You know, Stephanie, I was trying to ignore the red flags. Your mom controlling everything. The way she treated people like they existed to serve her. The way you always made excuses for her behavior. But this. He gestured to the swamp that was once Jake's backyard. This is insane. I don't think I can do this anymore. Stephanie's eyes widened. What are you saying? David sighed. I'm saying this isn't just a wedding disaster. This is a preview of the rest of my life. And I don't want to spend it cleaning up after your mom's messes. Stephanie gasped, tears welling in her eyes. You're breaking up with me? At our wedding. David ran a hand through his wet hair. What wedding? There's nothing left. And honestly, I think this is a sign. I don't want to be part of this family. The crowd that was left let out an audible gasp, and Karen turned pale. David, you don't mean that. This is just the stress talking. We can fix this. David shook his head. No, Karen. I think you and I both know this isn't just about today. I can't marry into this. With that, he turned and walked off, leaving Stephanie frozen in place, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to process what had just happened. The guests awkwardly shifted, unsure of whether they should say something or quietly disappear. Tom, the only decent HOA member Jake had ever met, stepped forward, rubbing the back of his neck. Look, Karen, I think we need to talk. Karen whipped around, her patience wearing dangerously thin. Not now, Tom. Yeah, actually now, Tom insisted. I got a call earlier from a few of the other HOA members. Seems word's getting around that you didn't actually have permission to do, well, any of this. And there's talk that you used HOA funds for personal expenses. That true? Karen's face twisted. Of course not. That's ridiculous. Tom crossed his arms. Because if it is, you could be looking at some serious consequences. Fraud, misappropriation of funds, possible legal action. And after today? I don't think anyone's going to be on your side when it comes to voting you out. Jake smirked, watching Karen squirm. He knew she was used to controlling the narrative, bending the rules to work in her favor. But this time, she had no way out. She had humiliated herself in front of everyone she tried to impress. Her daughter was furious with her. The wedding was a complete disaster, and now the people who once blindly followed her were turning against her. Karen let out a sharp laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Oh, come on, Tom. Don't be dramatic. It was a simple misunderstanding. The HOA funds are fine." Tom raised an eyebrow. "Then I guess you wouldn't mind if we did a full audit?" Karen's face twitched. "That won't be necessary." "Yeah," Tom said slowly. "I think it is." The whispers among the crowd grew louder, and Karen's expression darkened. She turned to Jake, her eyes full of venom. "This is your fault." Jake laughed. "Oh no, Karen. This is all you. You did this to yourself." Karen took a deep breath, composing herself. "You think you've won, don't you?" Jake shrugged. "I think I'm finally getting my yard back. And I think you're about to have a lot more to worry about than me." The first police car pulled up just as the last guests were leaving. One of the vendors must have called them about the unpaid bills, and Jake watched with amusement as Karen's expression flickered from anger to sheer panic. Stephanie had finally stopped crying, her makeup completely ruined, her shoulders slumped in defeat. "I can't believe this," she muttered. Jake almost felt bad for her. Almost. But then he remembered that she had stood by and let her mother trample over other people's boundaries for years. Karen stiffened as the officers approached. "Good evening, officers. I don't know what this is about, but I assure you." One of them held up a hand. "We've received reports about an unauthorized event on private property and possible fraudulent use of HOA funds. We need to ask you a few questions." Karen's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time in her life, she was speechless. Jake grinned. This was better than he ever could have planned. Tom walked over to Jake, shaking his head with a low chuckle. "Man, I gotta say, that was something else." Jake sighed, looking at what was left of his yard. "Yeah, well, I think I'm going to be dealing with the mess for a while." Tom patted his shoulder. "Hey, at least you won." Jake smirked. Yeah, I did." Karen, now red-faced and flustered, was led toward the police car as the questioning began. Her voice was sharp, defensive, but no one was listening anymore. The guests were gone. The wedding was ruined. The HOA was turning against her. Jake leaned against his porch railing, watching as Karen's empire crumbled before her eyes. This was the best day ever. The next morning, Jake stood in his backyard, surveying the aftermath of the greatest disaster in neighborhood history. The muddy water had mostly dried, leaving behind patches of brown stains on the grass and ruined decorations scattered across the lawn. A few wilted flowers were still clinging to the wedding arch, which was now leaning at an odd angle like a relic from a war zone. Pieces of broken plates and soggy napkins littered the ground, remnants of a celebration that never really happened. The wedding was over. The HOA was in chaos. And Karen, she was nowhere to be seen. Jake sipped his coffee, enjoying the silence. For the first time in years, there was no HOA threat looming over him. No Karen sneering from across the street. No ridiculous fines showing up in his mailbox. The wedding had not only exposed Karen's corruption, but it had finally given the entire neighborhood the push it needed to turn against her. No one had sympathy for her after the spectacle she had caused, and after the police started asking questions, it was clear that her reign was officially over. He chuckled as he remembered the moment Karen had realized she was losing control. The way her face had twisted in horror when the police car pulled up, the sheer panic in her voice as she tried to smooth over the situation. But there was no smoothing over a full-on fraud investigation. The other HOA board members had already begun distancing themselves from her, making sure to remind everyone that they had no idea she was misusing funds. Tom had promised Jake that a full audit was coming, and it wasn't looking good for Karen. The best part, the HOA had called for an emergency meeting to discuss the possibility of dissolving altogether. After years of suffering through Karen's ridiculous rules and petty fines, the homeowners had finally had enough. With the scandal unfolding and Karen's iron grip on the board shattered, people were starting to realize that they didn't actually need an HOA at all. The whole system had been Karen's personal tool of control, and now that she was gone, it was only a matter of time before the entire thing collapsed. Jake walked to his fence, looking across the street at Karen's house. The curtains were drawn, the front yard eerily quiet. Rumors were already spreading that she was planning to sell her house and leave town before the audit could catch up with her. He wouldn't be surprised. Karen was many things, but she wasn't the type to stick around and face the consequences of her actions. As he turned back toward his house, he noticed someone standing in his driveway. David, the almost groom, with his hands stuffed into his pockets, looking tired but surprisingly calm. Jake nodded toward him. "Didn't think I'd see you around here again." David gave a short laugh. "Yeah, well, I needed some closure, I guess." He looked around the yard, shaking his head. "Man, this place got wrecked." Jake smirked. "You should have seen it last night. The mosquitoes were having a feast. I think one of them carried off a bridesmaid." David snorted. "Honestly, I don't know whether to thank you or be mad at you. You ruined the wedding, but you might have saved my life." Jake raised an eyebrow. "So, it's officially over?" David nodded. "Stephanie tried to call me this morning, but I think we both know it wouldn't work out. Last night was a wake-up call. Her mom has controlled every part of her life, and if I had gone through with that wedding, I would have been stuck dealing with Karen for the rest of my life. I don't think I could survive that." Jake chuckled. "Probably not. She'd have HOA rules for your marriage. Section 5B. Husband must agree with wife's mother at all times or be fined accordingly." David laughed, shaking his head. "Yeah, exactly." He hesitated, then looked at Jake more seriously. "I know you didn't do what you did for me, but thanks. I think you saved a lot of people from a nightmare." Jake shrugged. "I just wanted my yard back. Everything else was just a bonus." David nodded, looking thoughtful. "So, what happens now?" "With Karen?" Jake smirked. "Oh, I think she's done. The HOA is falling apart, the board is turning on her, and she's got the police breathing down her neck. If she doesn't skip town, she's going to be in a whole lot of trouble." David let out a breath. "Good. She deserves it." He paused, then gave Jake a grin. "So, what's next for you? Gonna start renting out the yard for real weddings?" Jake laughed. "Yeah, right. I think I've had enough of that for one lifetime." David clapped him on the shoulder. "Well, if you ever change your mind, maybe consider charging next time." Jake smirked as David walked off, shaking his head. As much of a disaster as the whole thing had been, it was satisfying knowing that he wasn't the only one who had walked away from it with a win. Later that evening, as the sun started to set, Jake sat on his porch, enjoying the peaceful quiet of the neighborhood. It was funny, after all the chaos, after all the fighting, after everything Karen had done to make his life miserable, it had all come crashing down in a single night. He had spent years dealing with her ridiculous rules, dodging her fines, pushing back against her nonsense, and in the end, all it had taken was one over-the-top wedding and a little bit of dirty water to finally bring her down. He leaned back in his chair, stretching his legs out in front of him. For the first time in a long time, he felt truly relaxed. And then his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. A message from Tom. "HOA meeting tomorrow. Final vote on whether we're disbanding. Should be interesting. Bring popcorn." Jake grinned, shaking his head. Oh, he'd be there. After everything he had been through, there was no way he was missing that. As he put his phone down, he noticed movement across the street. Karen's front door opened, and for the first time since the disaster, she stepped outside. She looked around cautiously, as if she expected someone to jump out and confront her. She was wearing oversized sunglasses, despite the fact that the sun was nearly down, and she clutched her phone tightly in one hand. She hurried to her car, looking around nervously before getting inside and starting the engine. Jake watched as she pulled out of the driveway, her tires screeching slightly as she sped off down the road. He wasn't sure where she was going, but he had a feeling it wasn't just a quick trip to the store. He exhaled, leaning back in his chair again. Maybe she was finally gone for good. He took another sip of his drink, staring at the darkening sky. Peace at last. At least, until the next neighborhood disaster.